And I'm going to turn this over to our board member and executive committee member, Kelsey, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill, and hello, everyone. Welcome back to ISQOLS seminars. So as Jill mentioned, we are pleased to welcome today Dr. Christopher Boyce. And if you don't know Dr. Christopher Boyce, he's truly an interdisciplinary and just generally interesting researcher. So he initially trained as an economist and then went on to complete a PhD in psychology in 2009. His research centers on personality and the links between the economy and well-being. He's worked at various academic institutions, including the University of Warwick, Paris School of Economics, the University of Manchester, and the University of Stirling, where he still has an honorary position. He has published more than 25 peer-reviewed academic papers on happiness and well-being, and has written numerous media articles on the topic. He's involved in local, national, and international well-being policy discussions, and is a Well-Being Economy Alliance Research Fellow. Today, he's interested in contributing to the creation of conditions that foster individual and societal well-being. And of course, Christopher is the man who cycled to Bhutan in the new book, A Journey for Happiness, The Man Who Cycled to Bhutan. Personally, I'm very much looking forward to this talk. Christopher, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kelsey. Yeah, pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for signing up to listen. I'm kind of not sure what everyone's expecting. And I guess, as you probably all know, that having any expectations is not going to be so great for happiness anyway. So let's see how we get on. Big thanks to Kelsey for setting this up, and I guess in many ways convincing me that this would be appropriate to talk about to this group. So let's see how it goes. Like I say, no expectations is a way to go. Also, thank you to Jill for putting this out there and attracting people to come and listen to the talk. Really excited to be here. Let me just share my screen. So this talk is going to be loosely based around the journey that I made to Bhutan. I did have quite considerable experience as an academic, but I guess what motivated this journey was that I'd long wanted to live out my research in a kind of genuine, authentic way. And I think at the time when I left my academic job, which would have been in 2017, which I just found out was the year that me and Kelsey actually met, which is cool because the time does fly, and I thought it was longer than that even. And I guess on a bicycle to Bhutan seemed like the best way to do it. Probably not sure if I'd do that now, given where I am. I think I learned all the things and lessons that I needed to learn, and hopefully I'll be able to impart some to you here today. So I guess I want to make kind of 3 key points in this talk, and they're kind of all interlinked. The first of them is that scientific evidence basically has its limits. I'm having problems with my screen, so bear with me. I'm not that great at the old Zoom. And what I want to try and argue is that we really need to be paying attention to the stories that we're told and that we tell one another. Essentially, the stories that we tell one another and get told are important. And I think, if not more so than evidence. I'm pretty sure most people have got into a conversation where, presenting evidence, data or whatever about something isn't really enough, and actually sometimes seems to have the opposite effect, maybe entrenching someone else in a view that's opposite to ours, and maybe even entrenching ourselves. We become more staunch in the truth of which we see it. I guess what I've kind of noticed is that we like to think that we're rational beings, and perhaps more so being academics, weighing up evidence in a fair way. But we too are driven by stories, whether it's what we choose to research, how we interpret our data, they're essentially guided by stories. And what I want to say really is that evidence is important, but it's a mistake to ignore the importance of stories. And the second point I want to make is that happiness is not just about individual choice. So what I came what was quite clear to me is the dominant narrative is that happiness is all about choice, and the well-being agenda being dominated by economists and psychologists, which are generally individually orientated in terms of how they see the world, positive psychology, whether it's gratitude studies or building resilience, economists with their rational choice theories and so on. It's all oriented around choice. And yes, choice is part of it. But I'm also suggesting that that's also a narrative, that's a story. And I think that's preventing a deeper questioning of the wider economic and social system that we have to make those choices within. I don't see a system that really supports choices that move towards greater happiness and well-being. I go as far as to say that actually it's quite toxic. And what happens is that when people do struggle to make those choices, to be happy, to live well, it's often deemed as their fault. And what I believe is that that kind of story more or less just supports the status quo. And then the third one, a bit tongue-in-cheek here, the benefits of applying happiness research to our own lives. Well, it's obvious we should be happier for it. But I guess I'm kind of questioning is how much do we really get deep into actually living our research ourselves? We do want to stay dispassionate and distant from that research because maybe we can be less biased. But in honesty, I've not really met that many happiness researchers. I know I struggle with myself. I guess I went to too many conferences in windowless rooms, having traveled quite far, feeling really debilitated and tired to give talks to a sea of stern faces. And often it wasn't even a sea, more a kind of very trickle of a river, if that. So I guess what I'm going to say is until we live in alignment with the research that we do, and part of that entails recognizing that the academic, I'm sure people know, so the academic environment doesn't support the well-being, is that I'm going to question, well, what hope can there be for the research on a more wider scale? So there's a couple of caveats I want to kind of give about this talk. First of all, it's not an academic talk. It won't be well referenced. I have written a book and it does balance academic research with a journey, and I'm going to dip into elements of that book here, but it's not going to be well referenced. It's more or less based on my own musings around my experiences as an academic and a person that happened to cycle to Bhutan. I guess the whole purpose of my journey to Bhutan was to take things a little bit deeper, take it beyond the research, and ask myself very critical questions about who I was and how I wanted to be in the world. And I hope this talk encourages you to do the same. I'm sure most of you are doing it already. So yeah, as I say, the book is better referenced, so feel free to check that out, and I'll provide the link at the end. And also the other thing I want to say is that I'm defining happiness very broadly. For me, well-being is the kind of overarching aim and I think objective of society, the objective of an economy, as Kelsey mentioned there, being part of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, where the idea is that an economy should be about producing well-being for people and planet. But happiness fits within that well-being, and I look at it in a kind of subjective sense, and there's multiple understandings of happiness. But what I've often found is that people can be talking cross purposes when discussing happiness. So someone mentions happiness and they think about people smiling and laughing a lot, whereas someone else might think about feeling content or deeply fulfilled in life. So I think it's important to be clear, and they all have their place. And I'll talk about some of them specifically, but in a general sense, I'm talking quite broadly and using happiness, I guess, in place of well-being, because, hey, it captures people's attention a bit more, but I am talking about happiness in a broader sense. So where to begin about a man who cycled to Bhutan? I guess the best place to begin is with a story about stories. So to kind of give a background to me a little bit, my PhD was actually in psychology. My research topic was money and happiness. But before I began that PhD, I'd studied economics for nearly a decade. In high school, beginning at the age of 14, which is quite early for someone doing economics. I went on to do an undergraduate and then a master's. And I'd actually ended up in psychology. I actually started a PhD in economics, more because I was actually really pissed off with what they were teaching in economics. I'd started to become aware in my master's, and this is before the days where behavioral economics was quite, a standard course in our teaching. And just so much of it didn't make sense to me. And the things I would observe in the world and just these abstract models just didn't really make sense. And I felt like in psychology, I would find something a little bit different, more deeper explanation about how people really behaved. But the thing is, when I arrived in psychology, as all PhD students tend to do, is they get asked about, well, what are you going to be doing your PhD on? And I would quite happily say, well, I'm going to be doing that on money and happiness. And they'd all say, oh, well, that's very interesting, politely nod and smile. But I soon found out that behind those polite smiles was an inability to understand why I would want to waste any time researching such a topic. And they then went on to tell me that there's actually been decades of psychological research showing that money, though important for happiness up to a point, was on the whole not a very strong contributor to a person's happiness. So I was, a bit, very disheartened, really. I thought my PhD was in tatters and that was the end of that. But at the same time, it didn't really add up because I was coming from economics. And in economics, they were really excited about the question of money and happiness. In fact, any article I read on happiness in economics, almost entirely mentioned money. An interesting thing, there was scarcely any reference to the work in psychology. And the conclusion there was that money had a major role to play in making people happy. And in all the best academic journals, this was the case. And I guess I kind of didn't really clue on to the importance and relevance of this, but it took me probably several frustrated years and a lot of journal rejections to understand that it's basically impossible to publish in economics if the subtext of the research is that money isn't very important for happiness. Essentially, it doesn't really fit the story over there. But what I kind of saw is, as I published more research, because I was interested in actually joining the dots. Well, why are these differences in opinions? Can I use psychology to understand more deeply the money and happiness relationship? And every now and then I get a paper published and I put it out to the media to, basically saying money was not that important as people thought it would be. And every time I do that, there would be the people that would be aghast and just disgusted that I could even think such a thing, that money wasn't important for happiness. And then there would, of course, be other people who would be, of course, saying, well, yes, of course, it's not important. There are more important things. But then 3 months later, some other researcher would publish another research paper saying that it was important. And it would go back and forth. Each time you'd have people doing research, you'd have the public basically either agreeing or disagreeing, but no one was really changing their minds. More or less getting more angry about others not really seeing the truth as they personally saw it. And I guess what this is I didn't realize it at the time because I hadn't done much psychology, but it's a classic confirmation bias. We see what we believe rather than take stock of the evidence before us, weigh up the different research. We tend to dismiss what doesn't fit our beliefs. We all do it. If we're told something enough, we tend to believe it. And I guess in my years of economic studies, so coming from economics was really curious because that's the belief that I had it driven into me. There's barely a second would pass where you didn't have a model, again, fundamental assumption that money is really important and allows more choices and therefore more happiness. But the thing is like most people, I was actually hearing the money is important for happiness story long before I started doing economics. And what I want to say is that, the public do it, confirmation bias, but academics do it as well. It's a perfectly human thing to do. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just one of those biases that we have to consider in ourselves as well as other people and how we approach research. But nevertheless, I kind of sort of dismissed this and carried on gathering my evidence, thinking that was what was really important. So in the end, I spent about a decade doing research on money and happiness. And I published pretty well, trying to join the dots between economics and psychology. Why is it we believe money is more important than it really is? And I explored some really interesting things. For example, the extent that money's happy is because it provides a certain rank or status. Also trying to show that people's happiness was more sensitive to losses than gains. So that's a kind of classic loss aversion effect. Also highlighting the importance of indebtedness as being an important factor to unhappiness. And also I tried to show how other things were really important, more important, such as mental health, physical health, relationships, and personality. And the conclusion I came to in the end was quite simply that money may buy happiness, but often so little, it doesn't really matter. You know, so unless you're struggling or impoverished and struggling with debt, the importance of money is fairly minimal. And a good way to examine how much money matters is to compare it to other things. I'm sure people have probably seen similar things like this. You know, so a classic way to think about it is, well, how much does it explain of a person's happiness? So a typical correlation between income and well-being is 0.1 to 0.2, which means it explains at best 4% of a person's happiness. And then when you compare that to something like personality or social emotional skills, they explain 35%. Now, admittedly, that's subjectively measured, so there will be some extra correlation, but even still, it does point to an area in which we're spending a lot of energy when actually there's other things that are more important. We can look at more objective things by comparing how much equivalent money would be required for a person to experience the same well-being benefit as various life events. So something like marriage, for example. This became a really popular thing to do in economics about a decade or so ago, as a way of kind of putting monetary amounts on, you know, important life events, as in, you know, things that we couldn't really put value on. And it did illustrate that, but really what it was showing is actually the relative unimportance of money rather than actually the importance of the event. So something like marriage, for example, you know, it's equivalent to having $100,000 a year. This is each and every year. And this is quite a high amount, right? Seeing friends regularly, $115,000. Physical disability is worth $200,000 of happiness. And if you were to take a course of therapy, and it would improve your mental health to the equivalent of $240,000. A course of mental health therapy would cost probably in the region of $1,000, $2,000 or something much, much less. So this just kind of compares and contrasts different life events. And I guess, you know, I put out a question to anyone: what would you prefer? Would you prefer, and, you know, jokes aside about, you know, the quality of our relationships and the quality of our friends, but would you prefer the $115,000 a year or seeing your friends regularly? And it's a kind of very hypothetical question, and not a real one. But I think if you put that question to a lot of people, you probably find that some people would maybe think that they're going to get more happiness through the money than the actual other things. And the thing is that many people may sacrifice these areas of life for the sake of money. And in fact, when I look around society, I get the impression we actually sacrifice these things for much less money in terms of the jobs we work, and how we allocate our time. And yeah, there's a necessity in terms of, you know, the work that we do, of course, and so on. And I guess, you know, you can look at this and think about, this is people's choices. If people are choosing to do that, so what? Why should we matter? But then that's the kind of point I want to highlight. So when I'm talking about that work environment, you work 0 hours or 40 or maybe 40 plus quite considerable overtime. So it's not really just about choice. There's also a context to bear in mind here. And I guess the thing is that, you know, being quite philosophically minded, I was very internal and thinking about myself and how I was relating to my research. Did I actually embody these things in my day-to-day life? And I guess I didn't. I struggled to focus on developing my relationships, improving my health, and developing my personality and emotional skills. And I guess at some points, I often thought there was something wrong with me, and I just tried to get on with it. And I guess that's the problem, I think, is when we make happiness just about an individual choice. That there's something wrong with me can really be the only explanation, and you simply have to try harder, do better. But as behavioral scientists will tell us, we make choices within a context. And if that overarching context in which we make our choices is designed just to maximize productivity and efficiency, not our happiness, then it will be really difficult to make those choices for happiness than it needs to be. And I think this is the case for some more than others, because some people are squeezed more than others. And if I think about myself, and the privilege that I certainly have is that most people can't step outside the context entirely in the way I did and go on a cycling journey to a very obscure destination. So I recognize that, not having any dependents as well is another factor, but also just having, the privileges that I do, being an academic and being able to flow through society in a different way. So why would I cycle there? Well, I'm pretty sure everyone here will know of Bhutan. It's a country that focuses its national policy around maximizing its happiness rather than economic growth. So there you've got a backdrop of a different context. And so for an unhappy happiness researcher, it seemed like a very fitting destination. And going there by bicycle seemed like a very fitting mode of transport to get there and enable me to create a journey for happiness. Basically, I wanted to get deeper into my personal understanding of happiness through journeying to Bhutan. I knew that I would be better able to live my research on the bicycle than in the academic world, and that felt really important to me at the time. This was 5 years ago. I knew that the bicycle would bring me more connection. I'd certainly toured in various places, and everyone's curious about the guy with big bags on his bicycle. Where are you going? Where have you come from? And the next thing you know, you can be having dinner with someone's family, maybe camping up in their garden. I knew it would give me better health physically, as long as I didn't push it too far, which I admit happened on numerous occasions. But after a while of touring and getting myself stuck many times, I learned to slow down, and it would give me time to reflect on who I am and I guess who I wanted to be. But beyond that personal reason, I really wanted to tell a story that would get people interested in the research that I knew really well, and wasn't having much success in terms of sharing that to the wider world. And I wanted to highlight both this choice aspect of happiness, because there are things that we can do, but also the context in which sometimes the things that we can do are not made that easy by that context. And I think that we have a long way to go with regard to having a system that's anywhere close to supporting the well-being of people and planet. So this is how I did it. It's not the obvious route to get from Scotland, which is where I was living and researching at the time, to get to Bhutan. And it took me 18 months to get there, twice as long as I thought it would be. And I guess if I'd taken shorter time about it, I think I would have had less happiness. And if I'd taken longer, I would have maybe had even more. I'm not sure, but that's how long it took. I cycled 12,000 plus miles, passing through 25 countries. And I'm proud to say I came back a very happy man. Although I think the last couple of years it's taken a bit of a dent. But I would definitely say the stuff that I learned on the bicycle was pretty integral to making life a little bit easier over the last couple of years in terms of connecting to what's important. But I did spend quite a considerable amount of time unemployed, which wasn't great after coming back from a journey like that. But I guess also it was another experience of genuinely living my research, because I had experienced, I had done a lot of research on unemployment as well. So as I say, it's not an obvious route, but I wanted to go to certain specific places that I felt were doing something particularly curious when it comes to the context. So, for example, Latin American countries, as I'm going to come on to later, experience happiness in a very interesting and curious way, which to some respects would make them the happiest people on earth. And they have lots of interesting things in their culture. So indigenous populations have you know, more reverence for communitarian type well-being. So in terms of sumac corse, which is popularized buen vivir in Spanish language, is a kind of sense of more community sense of well-being. And there's also, you know, through Pachamama, there's respect for the Mother Earth. And I wanted to kind of see whether how much this affected people's day-to-day lives, and how much that I would experience that as I journey through on a bicycle, which I guess in many ways is very respectful for the earth, and is also connecting. Making it somewhere to Costa Rica was also an important part of my journey, which I think in some respects the most progressive place in the world when it comes to policy. You know, having happiness and health levels that are comparable, if not better, than say North America, but does that on a fractional amount of income per head and resource use. And they have a really cool expression there called pura vida, which is essentially, you know, we don't have much, but we're happy. It's like a pride in having the simple life. And, you know, up to that time, as a researcher, I've been exploring having a simple life, and I really wanted to go there and experience. And actually in Costa Rica, I had such a joyful time because I actually slowed down in a way that I hadn't learned to do, because I was partly embodying a lot of the things in which my context had conditioned me to do. To get somewhere, I have to be somewhere other than where I was, achieving, striving, full of expectations. I also wanted to work my way up to Canada, which has, you know, probably one of the most progressive indexes of well-being on a national and regional level, and being used very well to improve people's lives. I wanted to then maybe find out if I could understand something about countries that meet their basic population needs without busting the Earth's biosphere. So, you know, that kind of idea of what is a developed country in things like donut economics. The idea that, you know, you can't call a developed country a country that's barely meeting population needs, but doing it by using all the resources, which is what most countries that we would classically define as developed. Developed countries are actually countries that are living within their limits, but also meeting basic population needs. Countries like Costa Rica and Cuba also do well with this regard. But I was interested in Vietnam because I think in the donut economics, that one seems to be an outlier. So I wanted to explore that and see if that was intention or not. And then finally, I want the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which I'm a fellow and huge advocate of, because that actually started up whilst I was journeying, and I only came across them when I was, meeting some government officials in Costa Rica. We started talking about that. And for me, having that objective of an economy to improve the well-being of people and planet seems essential. Isn't that what, the purpose of an economy should be? So I was getting behind that. And then eventually I would find my way to Bhutan, which sometimes misleadingly gets called the happiest place on earth, which I already knew that it wouldn't be, but also I think doesn't undermine what they're doing there, which is creating something that's different, progressive model of development. So who are the happiest people and who say so and why? I think this is an important question to ask, but I want to say is that we have to be careful about how we ask this question, because the answer we get might depend on who we ask. And so I think I'm going to, start by kind of describing happiness. Most people might be familiar with this. I'm not sure, but in terms of how we differentiate types of happiness. So I take a subjective approach to happiness. It's how I understood happiness when I was an academic, primarily using such as valuative type questions of happiness, life satisfaction, for example, what we might consider a thinking type of happiness. I don't believe subjective assessment of happiness is the only way, but I do think it's something we really need to pay attention to and use it to ask deeper questions about our society. Personally, I'd like to see more kind of objective indicators of well-being, more on a national scale, quality of life indicators, with subjective measures informing what is really important to measure objectively. So as I say, to answer who's the happiest, we have to define it. And the thing is, there's different types of happiness. And what I'm going to illustrate here is what I think there's 4 main kinds of happiness, and they're all interlinked, but they also have distinct differences. And what I've noticed when I talk about happiness is that, people are talking cross purposes, but also some people seem to consider some kinds of happiness to be more important than others. I don't. I think the different kinds of happiness serve different purposes, and we as academics and human beings need to pay attention to all of them. So I'm going to illustrate the types of happiness with a picture. So this picture was taken on my 2nd day of cycling in Latin America. It was taken by a chap called Carlos, who I just happened to ride past one day as he was working on the road that you see I'm on. And you see it's a dirt track of a road, and by my mind, he seemed to be making it more of a dirt track than anything else. But he stopped me and offered me just a really cool drink of orangeade, and I was in a kind of sort of weird, distrusting, who is this guy? What does he want? Type mode, which I think is typical of any. Of at least in my culture, the context I'm from, in terms of when someone asks you something out of the blue. But we just shared a moment together. He shared some of his cool orange drink, and we had a chat in my barely broken Spanish at the time, which massively improved until bizarrely I found myself on Mexican TV 9 months later, which is always a curious thing for me to watch. But yeah, he stopped, gave me his drink, and I particularly like this picture, not only because it reminds me of Carlos and one of my very early encounters of kindness through multiple encounters of kindness in Latin America and across my whole journey, but it has me wide-eyed with early journey energy. There's so much going on for me at this moment in time. You might be able to see some of it. I guess if you look carefully, you'll see what might be a faint smile on my face. It's somewhat shadowed, but there's a smile on my face, and that's because I'm happy in a very hedonic sense. This is kind of feeling pleasurable. I'm feeling good, having met Carlos and shared a moment with him. This is the sort of happiness that comes and goes. However, what you might not see is that behind that smile, there is a ton of anxiety. As you can imagine, fresh out, not having a clue what this journey would come from it. And this is also a hedonic side of happiness, and where we might call the smiling type of happiness, hedonic happiness, a positive effect. This type of happiness would be considered a negative effect. But that doesn't mean it's bad, and nor does it mean that we should try and avoid it. And what I've come to the conclusion is that being able to experience both positive and negative emotions and use them to understand ourselves and act as kind of indicators and pay attention to them, that was an important part of my journey, understanding that. And they're an important part of the human experience. And I guess what I've seen, at least in my context, is and culture is an encouragement to push them away or chase them. And that has never really serves happiness in the longer term. But behind all of that is a man with meaning and purpose in his life in a way that he hadn't experienced before. So what I think in this type of happiness is it's more a kind of deeper fulfillment for me. And the joys and challenges aside, it's having purpose and meaning in my life that was driving me day to day on this journey and drove me all the way through this journey. And there were plenty of times when, the challenges were so great that I wanted to come home. And this is what the ancient Greeks would have called the eudaimonic happiness, or as present day psychologists think about it, as the more kind of human flourishing or thriving type of happiness, where we're feeling purposeful, we're connected, we're esteemed and feeling hopeful. And I had everything of that through meeting Carlos and also just being on this journey, which felt then very much beyond me. But then lastly, there is that thinking type of happiness. And I don't have much of that type of happiness here, because this is the sort of happiness that comes when we evaluate our lives relative to some norm or expectation. And it's an important type of happiness, like any type of happiness, but it tends to be attributed to achieving certain goals. And of course, I hadn't arrived in Bhutan. I was nowhere near. I was still probably thinking about the next town to get to, and probably didn't give Carlos my full attention because I was somewhat, I guess, coming from the society and culture I've come from to think about wrapping up happiness with goals and achievement. but it gets researched the most, and that's important. And I'm going to suggest that this is because it seems to better fit a certain type of story. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So,
Chris, I just want to jump in, Christopher, just for a second. You have about 20 minutes left.
okay.
So if we do 10 minutes for questions, then I would say about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. I've probably been chatting a little bit too much. It's weird because you can't see everyone, can you?
No, that's a challenge. Yeah, but great otherwise. So
yeah, sure. So who are the happiest people in the world? We might say Finland or Denmark, but this is largely based on the yearly country rankings that we released on International Day of Happiness. And the problem here is that the depiction of this happiest people is based on an evaluative type of happiness. Imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 to 10, where the top of the ladder represents the best possible life and the bottom, the worst possible life. Which step on the ladder do you feel you are? And this is a great question, but it doesn't mention happiness, and it doesn't mean it's not valid. Yeah, we have to be careful and clear about what we're asking people and the reasons people score high on these questions. And typically it's because someone is doing well compared to the expectations and norms. It's bound up with the achievement and success. So whether someone thinks they are happy as opposed to feeling happy, so it's whether you think you have the things you need to be happy rather than feeling happy in the moment. And that's an important distinction. So it's quite strongly related, it's more strongly related to income per capita than other measures of happiness. And you see here that there's a strong correlation up to about $20,000 per year. Above 20,000 to 30,000 is pretty minimal, and above 30,000 you could pretty much draw a line through those countries. Yet there are countries that do significantly better, such as the Nordic countries. But there's also other countries and other types of happiness. And here you have the standard ranking: Finland, Denmark, Norway, all at the top. But compared to that, as well as their ladder score, and then next to that, you have the proportion of time people spend enjoying and smiling and laughing. And you see that, you know, the country that's actually top of that list is Paraguay, with 90% of people on average experiencing enjoyment or smiling and laughing all the time. And it's typically Latin American countries that do the best there. And I guess what I wanted to do on my journey is see if I could soak something of that up. And what I think is important is that, you know, if we're talking about happiness, why not exclude certain types of happiness over others? Because it's important, whilst it's important to think we're living a happy life, it's also important to feel that we're happier as well. And I think this is what this question unpicks. So I kind of think maybe a combination of scores would be more appropriate. And if we did this with these two types of happiness, then it's Netherlands that do well. Costa Rica jumps to third. And what I'm just going to suggest is that maybe we don't talk about this type of happiness because it doesn't fit a certain story. The World Happiness Report is largely conducted by economists. And, you know, the idea that, you know, a smaller, medium-sized economy is what is good for well-being isn't going to be popular with other economists. So it's important to think about the narrative and stories here. So this is how this happiness compares when you look at income per capita. And you see that there's no correlation at all. And Latin American countries do so much better. So I'm going to skip on. So I guess a lot of my journey was about, if you like, getting out of my head, overcoming that thinking type of happiness, always feeling like I had to be somewhere and meet certain expectations. And I guess at the start of my journey, I was tied up in my head trying to get to Bhutan. And that, I feel, is a conditioning that I've experienced. And 10 months on a bicycle helped me embrace the culture in Latin America. And I began to unpick the barriers to experiencing that type of happiness. First, there was letting go of the expectations of needing to be anywhere. And that actually meant, for me, letting go of Bhutan. I never really needed to go to Bhutan. And I guess I realized that early on. And the reason I kept going was because it was actually an interesting story behind it. And it actually enabled a purpose beyond myself in which I could share about research and happiness. I then began to slow down a lot more, realizing I needed to be nowhere other than where I was. I spent many days camping on beaches on Costa Rica, cycling little kilometers, 50 kilometers a day, meeting whoever I met. I began to listen to myself, and through that, taking time, I began to connect more deeply with others, and I got happier in this sense. I was learning something about how to make my relationships better. So it's not just about having the time for these things, but it's also having the know-how. And I didn't know how. And I guess by being on a bicycle, connecting with people in Latin America, I learned something about that. So the only kind of, I guess it would be a little bit remiss if I didn't ask myself how happy I was on my journey. And I did that using a very standard question in happiness: is overall, how happy did I feel yesterday? And I tracked that every day of my journey. And you can see here that it's very up and down, as it naturally will be. And as I pointed out before, this isn't the sort of happiness you should chase or push away when it's unhappy. It's the sort of thing that we need to pay attention to. And what I noticed is the more I paid attention to it, by enjoying the conversation and staying with that conversation and maybe getting invited for food, rather than thinking, you know what, I'm really enjoying this, but I need to be somewhere else, or thinking I'm in real pain, therefore, but I'm in real pain and I'm not going to listen to that. I'm going to keep my head down and keep cycling. By listening to it, more happiness seemed to show up, which is obvious really when I reflect back on it. But yeah, it was a powerful journey. There were ups and downs, and there were key moments. A rather daunting experience of a dog bite in Peru, 3 months in. I had some crazy cycles where I just pushed myself too far, but eventually things got better and had some fantastic times. As I was saying to Jill earlier, in Arizona, probably one of my favorite places to have been, cycled through in the high desert, enjoying things. And a lot of my work was unlearning ways of being in this world, reconditioning myself. And I learned to lean into the people around me, and I was pretty free and easy by the end of the ride. And what you can see is that there is an initial decline in my happiness up until a moment in Panama where I really changed things, and then happiness started to rise, and the ups and downs weren't so pronounced. But then when I got to Canada, after some horrendous experiences in what I call the capital of misery, Las Vegas, which I went there intentionally to explore, I guess, the antithesis of what a happy society would look like. But I eventually made it to Bhutan. And the thing is that there were many times when I never thought I'd get to Bhutan. Dog bite incident was horrible. The experiences in Panama, a family member passed away. And as I said, I had some really severe mental health crisis in Las Vegas, because it's a pretty toxic environment, to be fair. And I considered going home many times. But I think the biggest test for me was when I got to Canada, and I was pretty lonely, and I've been on the road a year, which was way longer than I thought it would take. And I was feeling cold, winter was coming, and I really missed home. And I literally was on my way home, which is why you see I took a train to Toronto. It was kind of on the way home, and also to meet the director of the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, who's a really good guy, and I've had some connection with him in the past. But I got on a 4-day train, and when I got off the train, suddenly there was all this media interest in my journey, and I suddenly realized is that, by continuing the journey, it didn't really matter about me. I'd learned all I needed to learn. But the journey was fascinating to people, and by continuing it and one day reaching Bhutan, my journey would basically be more interesting to people than were I never to do so. And that would be a way of introducing people to the research. So I continued on. And I crossed over to Hong Kong, staying south enough just to keep warm, and eventually worked my way to Bangkok. And it was actually in the mountains of Laos when I suddenly realized there was a good chance I'd be able to arrive on the International Day of Happiness in 2019. I'd never planned it to be this way. As I said, I was supposed to do it in half the time. But most of this final part of the journey was about deepening on what I'd already learned. Staying present focused, managing, confronting my anxiety, pretty anxious guy, leaning into well-meaning others, and that was people that I've met as well as people far away at home, acknowledging my limits, being wary of certain environments that can be quite toxic for my happiness and health. So I continued on to Bhutan, and I did arrive at the Tiger's Nest Monastery on International Day of Happiness in 2019. And I guess I've wondered whether I could take claim to being the happiest person in the happiest place on the happiest day. I'm pretty sure none of those things are true, because Bhutan, it's got its problems. It's a subsistence economy. And I guess it doesn't do well at the typical happiness rankings that we're maybe more familiar with, ranking, I think, 85th or something in the year that I cycled there. But it does have a very inspiring take on happiness. And also, what I was really curious about Bhutan is it's not happiness as through the lens of the Western academic sees it, but it's actually happiness in the sense of how the Bhutanese see it. And admittedly, it is still a top-down structure, hierarchical governmental structure, with a king and so on. So there is dubious about how much conversation is going on at local level, but it is still happiness as Bhutanese see it. And I think that's really important, defining things in our own terms. And actually, if you think about happiness policy in Bhutan, I actually felt like the way that they experienced happiness there is much more in line with the eudaimonic type of happiness and the purpose-seeking type of happiness. Often known as the word for happiness in Bhutan is dekyad, which actually means peace and tranquility, which is not the kind of understanding of happiness in the English language. Happiest day. I'm not sure International Day of Happiness could be crowned as the happiest day. I think it does more to remind people that they're not doing things that they know they should be doing and could be, and no, not could be doing, that they should be doing to have a happier life. And I think a lot of that represents the context in which we're in. Of course, people know what's good for their happiness. I knew before I started doing happiness research, the relationships, having purpose and meaning, my health and my personality, who I am. I knew they were important before I started researching happiness. It was good to put the numbers on it, at least so I could show that actually money's not as important as we often think. But we know these things intrinsically. So to remind people on that day, for me, is a curious thing, which probably might lead to less happiness. And as for the happiest person, well, you'd think that having cycled 500 days, 12,000 miles, I'd be happy. I wasn't, I was exhausted. And I guess for me, it links to that. I knew that being happy in Bhutan was not, upon arrival, was not what this journey was about. So yeah, I wasn't my happiest, but I was quite relieved, I'd say. So I want to kind of reveal kind of 3 personal learnings. And these are learnings that I would never have learned had I not stepped out of the academic world. And the curious thing about these learnings is that they are relevant to context as much as they are choice. So one of the most important things is that, giving to other human beings. We do compare, we blame and judge, but we also like to give. And it's an important part of our nature to want to help others. And I guess in my context, in my society, you're not meant to look like you need help. You're meant to be self-sufficient and reliant, and that's, and independent from other people. So people don't offer help because it will probably be rejected. And what I found is that by leaning into people, actually, I enabled other people to give. It was a gift to them to allow them to give to me, if that makes sense. And I guess if we don't lean into one another, then we actually receive and give gifts, then we miss an opportunity for connection. And connection is a fundamental part of happiness. But it's not actively encouraged in my culture. So also one about anxiety. I'm a pretty anxious person, and I sometimes question why that is. I think I have a natural tendency towards it, but I also think I've had a tendency to get lost in that anxiety. And I guess hours and hours on a bicycle in dangerous parts of the world, you kind of reflect quite heavily on fear about people who have told you that the place is to be scared of. And actually, I found out that people were really, really nice, really hospitable. And I guess it's that realization that a lot of my fear is passed on to me from others. It's there in the context that serves a certain purpose. Keep me scared, fearful, anxious, in some senses consuming more things, keeps me trapped, not out there taking risks, connecting with people, worrying about not having enough, rather than appreciating what I really have. And then the final one is about action without awareness. And the idea is, Kelsey.
Christopher. Yeah, sorry. I'll just let you know. So we have 5 minutes left, but we'll go a little bit over. But yeah, just to move quickly.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kelsey. I'm nearly done. Just got a couple more slides, but thank you. Yeah, it's this idea that, we're so busy trying to solve problems, and often we don't really understand what the problem is in the first place. And what I've noticed is that in that kind of busyness, which is again part of the context we just end up creating more problems for ourselves rather than sitting back and being with it and trying to understand the problem before us. And I think we'd be better serving ourselves by pausing to understand the situation first. So they're my personal learnings. There's much more in the book, and I think these are the things I knew that I'd learned when I came back immediately, and then the book takes things to a different level. So I want to finish by addressing the power of story, by ending with a final story, and this one involves my dad. He's quite a feature in the book. My dad is not an academic. He left school when he was 15 years old, and he had no qualifications. In fact, when I was growing up, he was a window cleaner. Now, if you think about how he relates to me as, his son who went to university, who then went on to become an academic expert on happiness, he's always been proud of that and what I've done, but he's never really understood it. And I can tell you for sure, he certainly never read any of my research. And our relationship has been pretty bad over the years. We're worlds apart. We don't connect. But put me on a bicycle, and when I began cycling to a place he'd never heard of and had no care for, the relationship with my father transformed. And through that journey, he was relating to what I was doing, finally, in a way that he couldn't before. He connected to the research that I was trying to share with people prior to this journey through the story of me cycling to Bhutan. And I guess he wasn't the only person that seemed to really enjoy and love the unconventional story, a story that didn't really make sense. Why would you leave that, that successful career to go and do something like that? An unconventional story of the man who cycled to Bhutan. And I guess that leaves me on that note of acknowledging the power of stories. And then we can overturn the ones that do not serve us, because there's a lot of stories out there, the narratives that don't serve us. And that's why when I returned, I set about writing a book about it all, which pieces together, interweaves research with the journey itself, as well as my personal story in terms of coming to that research and learning about how it fits into my life. So if you'd like some more, there is a book. I don't know if anyone here has read it. Kelsey tells me hasn't read it yet. But it's I actually self-published it, and I went for a crowdfund. And what I really like about the way I've done it and how I'm selling it as well is you can't get it on Amazon. You can get it from a few local shops or on my website. Is that it lives and breathes connection. The punchline to the book is about connection to ourselves, to each other, and to the wider world. And even just the way that you get the book engenders that connection. Because, hey, you have to come to my website and I'll probably email you and go, hey, thanks for getting the book, And so it's a really nice way to have done things. And that is me.
Thank you very much, Christopher. So it looks like we're having a few more people join now. And so I wonder if people may have misunderstood the time. So unfortunately, for those of you who have joined, we are just wrapping up now. We have a few minutes for questions. And so I would like to invite people to either raise their virtual hands or to write in the chat box, those of you who have a question. It looks like Joseph Antoine, you can go first, and we have Francesco shortly thereafter.
Good afternoon. In my part of the world, it's still morning. Apparently, there was a mix-up because I saw the time as 11 Eastern Daylight Time. So I came in, I was coming in for 11, so apparently I missed the whole section. I prepared for this for weeks, so I'm a little bit disappointed. Is it possible that we can get, and the recording will be available?
Yes, I apologize for the time mix-up. yeah, sorry, it's just a mistake. Yes, the recording is available soon after we're finished here. It'll go up on YouTube. So you'll be able to see everything that Christopher spoke about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I cannot add anything to it, into the conversation because I didn't hear much.
Right.
Just about a minute I was done. Thank you.
Yep. So I apologize for that, Joseph.
I'm tuning in from Grenada in the Caribbean.
Okay. Yep. Francesco, you were next.
Hi, great, thanks. Thanks a lot, Chris. Very, very interesting. Basically, what I kind of understood from your story is that something you learned on your way through Latin America is that social relations matter a lot for our well-being. And I wonder if that's something that you kind of knew for yourself and you needed to experience, or if it is really an emerging property of this trip. And related to social relations, we frequently use, in our surveys, trust as a measure of social relations. I wonder if, after your experience, you would say that trust is still a good proxy for the quality of relationships among people, and also whether this trip allowed you to build trust in others, because you happen to, to share an orange juice with someone you never met before on your trip. Mm-hmm. So, did you learn to trust others?
Yeah, really nice. Nice question. Yeah, nice set of questions, Francesco. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I knew for myself, I looked at enough data to know that social relationships are important. I guess there's a difference between knowing something's important and then the how. I know it's important, but actually, how do you have good quality relationships? I know it's something I'm probably forever going to struggle with, but I think being around people and how they relate when the relationships are warm and friendly can build up a lot of learning. So I knew it was, and that's why I wanted to go there on a bicycle, because I knew that I would learn something about the how, not that it was. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, so in terms of trust, is that trust as a proxy for social?
I meant the quality of social relations. Yes,
qualities. I think it's a good proxy. Yeah, I would say for me, yeah. I think I'd more speak to the final question is whether my trust built as a result of the journey, and I'd say yes, it certainly did. I guess it's that, when I'm talking about Carlos at the start there, and he's like beckoning me to stop. I remember specifically thinking, what does this guy want? And being really distrusting. And I was very much like that in the earlier. Then I realized that this is how people are. And actually, you just lean into it. And I guess I did that on so many countless times, to the point where I still had a distrust in mind. And I guess I see that more as relating to the conditioning that I've experienced growing up. But I just learned to ignore that, because that's just my mind. And then I just listened more to my body sensorially. Is there a reason to be worried here? And there wasn't. So yeah, I think it did definitely build my trust, and I feel way more trusting in my life, my relationships. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. But yeah, I do think it is a good proxy for social quality of social relationships. We have to be able to trust one another. And I think trust is built through giving and receiving, sharing, recognizing that interdependence.
Thank you.
Daniela, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you for excellent presentation and interesting. I will try to be efficient, and I have a keyword, digitalization. But please let me prepare the question, if may I. as an economist, and especially when we do apply work in a longitudinal perspective, initial conditions are important. And into that aspect, I don't know how much was you addicted to your phone and digital world, digital contacts, and so on. But for me, it will be very interesting if you could very shortly tell us a little bit about this, because I would like to learn a little bit more about the fact that sometimes it's important to get to be connected, to have access to information. And in the case that you do not have that, what will happen? But as I told you, I know that it's not possible to cover everything. But my simple question to you is, regardless if you was addicted or let's say dependent on your digital connection before starting this journey, what would you summarize in a few words the importance of digitalization when traveling alone everywhere? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. I'm a bit old school. I prefer my physical maps, and actually I didn't actually possess a smartphone before I left, and my brother gave me a really old knackered smartphone, which was good for taking photos, and that was pretty much about it. And I remember when it died after 2 weeks, the battery just went off, and I was actually just like, oh, that's a bit of a pain, but it was no great loss. So for me, I really love maps, and what I like about the maps, right, is when I had a physical map. And I did, because I actually bought my own smartphone 6 months in when I was in Costa Rica. And it was a really interesting shift in how I interacted with people. Because I go to, with a physical map, people can relate, they can connect in and point out. And it's almost like there's a curiousness and fascination of seeing a map that some people would never have seen of their lands. So that was really nice. So I think it can be important, but I also think what I noticed is that technology gets in the way of connection for me. Like the map is a very classic example. No one's going to touch your screen and scroll.
Okay, you touch one of the aspects, but my aspect was a little bit in connection with Francisco's question about these social contacts, and especially during this Corona period when people talk about this digital connection, to say so. And into that perspective, it seems extremely interesting that you're totally not updating and connected with people. During this time, you make connection, but at the same time, you said that it's important to connect, and you talk about your father and connection and what means and so on. But what happened with all other people who love you, who miss you, who could not be in touch with you?
Yeah, I think that's choices that need to be made, right? And if I'm going to stay connected to people digitally far away from me, then that is going to get in the way of my connection with the people that I'm going to meet. And you see it all the time. I'm on my phone rather than actually where I am. And I think we have to ask ourselves whether that's how we want to be. And yeah, there's choice involved in it. But you look at you look at phones and any apps, they're designed in a way with using behavioral insights and techniques to keep you scrolling, to keep you flicking through. And that's okay, it keeps you connected, but it's actually, a lot of things with technology is they claim to meet certain needs, but they never really meet the need, not in a real way. So it's for me, like ultimately I want to be in a room with people in person for real. And if that can't happen, that's okay. But I want to, use technology in a way that supports that eventual connection with that person. I can talk about my brother. I mean, he's in Indonesia, and I'll probably only going to see him 2 or 3 times in my life ever again, just by nature of him living so remotely. But we have a conversation every single week using Zoom, and that's great. Yeah, I kind of think it's like if that technology wasn't there, then yeah, even my brother probably wouldn't be able to live there, or I probably wouldn't see him at all. And I think that in some level, I've got to be okay with that, because I don't think I need to connect with everyone all of the time because there's too many people. So yeah, I think it's an interesting play. And I think on a bicycle, you get to explore and consider these things. And I guess I wasn't very a fan of it before I left anyway.
Okay,
a very short detail, did you look at the literature between traveling alone and well-being before starting this trip?
I didn't know.
I will not say more. Thank you.
I didn't. No, I didn't. I should have, but I didn't. I just knew I had to do it. I mean, who else is going to want to cycle to Bhutan?
So, Christopher, that's actually a perfect segue into my question, but I will just say, I'm sorry, everyone. So there was a mix-up just once more with the time zone. So we will be making the recording available. We are now 10 minutes after the initial finish. So I would say if anybody has one last question, please chime in now. Otherwise, I can ask a question, and then we'll wrap up and again make the recording available. Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands going up. Oh, and Sue, if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Great, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Christopher, for such a great presentation. I also only caught the last leg of it, but what you said about your dad really resonated in terms of this sort of disconnect with understanding the academic side of things and more of the, I guess, non-academic side of understanding your trip and how that played into your happiness. So in your opinion, do you have any, I guess, sort of opinions about how to bridge that gap between academic research and happiness and also like real life experiences and stories?
Yeah, that for me speaks to the idea of living the research, which I guess was an important element of the cycling to Bhutan, and bringing it into the realm of story and acknowledging that importance of the story. It does make it more relatable. As much as we can really try and write our academic papers as clear and concisely as possible, you know, and someone could understand it, but they're not going to pick them up and read it. So I think when we bring it through story, it can really connect people more deeply to these things. And have I got any advice how to do that? It's difficult. I think, you know, have the academic hat on and do the research, but also do our best to really live it and live it authentically, embody it in a really real way. I don't know if that helps. You're probably trying already to do it. I think most people are, aren't they?
Yeah, but no, that's good to kind of just know that that's out there, and that's yeah, like qualitative research is something so prominent, but it's so hard to show and tell a story the way you do in research, I think.
Yeah. If you just got to acknowledge the importance of story, it is really important. Evidence is going to have its limits. When I'm speaking to someone like my dad, I mean, I've told him 1,000 times about money and happiness, but he doesn't believe me, and he keeps playing his lottery, and you know, doesn't work on the important things in life. But you know, it's my dad, and I love him. So, what can you do?
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
That is perhaps the best way to finish a presentation. So very much big thanks, Christopher. So it's such an interesting story. As you said, because you wrote to Bhutan, we don't have to.
Exactly.
So I do recommend checking out the book. I am enjoying reading it, although I haven't finished it yet. And you will be able to see the recording. Jill will be sending out an email soon. I apologize again for that mistake. It was just a time zone error. Jill, if you had anything to say to finish.
Yeah, thank you again, Christopher. That was fantastic. And to everyone who joined us late, apologies. We'll be sending that recording soon, along with any details about our upcoming conference. Assure you no time zone difficulties there. Hopefully you can join us virtually or in person. Thank you again, Christopher. It was a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's nice to present to everyone. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Kelsey.
Thanks, Christopher.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Take care. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.